Go.
Hello Year 10, it's Miss Lyford, Mrs Edmonds and Miss Earnshaw here again, and today we're going to be talking through a bit of poetry comparison. So you should see on your screen 2 poems that you looked at last week, and we're going to be looking at the question, how poets present ideas about power in Ozymandias and one other poem, in this case, London.
So this is the type of exam question that you will be given in the real exam next year. The exam question will give you 1 poem to look at, in this case Ozymandias, and the second one would normally be a choice, but as Miss Lyford's already said, we've chosen to look at London because we think the 2 poems go together really well for this type of exam question. We've chosen 2 different types of power that we thought that you could compare. So the main purpose of this podcast is for you to listen to our ideas and then take any that you like or add to them and fill in an essay plan, either as you're going along or afterwards. So we're going to consider the idea of abuse of power, first of all, for these 2 poems. So we'll be annotating in... Is it a grey, Miss Lyford, would you say?
On my screen it looks purple. I've just written abuse.
Abuse of power in purple. So first of all, obviously we see this king in the form of Ozymandias within the poem, who in his lifetime was a king who did abuse the power that he had. We see him less able to maintain that sense of power after death, but in his lifetime he was a king who seemed to enjoy power and perhaps abuse that power in terms of the subjects that he led in his kingdom.
Yeah, so I think the presentation of that persona, that central persona of Ozymandias, is really key in terms of a method for answering this question, isn't it? Like Miss Lyford's just underlining here, the statement on the pedestal, my name is Ozymandias, king of kings, look on my works ye mighty and despair. This idea that it's being spoken by Ozymandias himself means we get the sense of his, I don't know what word would use to describe his attitude there.
I suppose he's controlling what is presented about him, isn't he? This kind of idea that he is speaking through this inscription on the pedestal and presenting himself, self-presenting himself as the king of kings, this almost godlike figure. So he's got that sense of control over how he's presented through the statue.
And yeah, that ultimate superiority, the idea you mentioned of him being godlike through that reference to King of Kings, I think is really important as people are adding to their essay plans.
Yeah, definitely. And he obviously believed that others did despair and did fear him in life when he was king and wants to maintain that sense of power after death. The other references in the poem where we see that sense of power, I think sneer of cold command is a really nice phrase to look at. We get the sense there that the sculptor has really captured the characteristics of Ozymandias as a king and the way that he treated his subjects and the way that he actually presented himself quite purposefully, I think.
Yeah, it's as if the sculpture is a symbol of his abuse of power, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think that sneer gives that sense of superiority again, doesn't it? Almost links to that King of Kings. And I always think the alliteration of cold command is quite harsh sounding and kind of reflects that same feeling of kind of coldness and kind of looking down on people and that sense of being above everyone else.
I agree. If you sneer at someone, you quite often believe that you are above them, don't you? And you are, as you said, superior to them, that you are deserving of more power.
Yeah. I think some of the verbs are important as well, aren't they, in terms of abuse of power, like stamped and mocked.
Yeah.
They're attributed to Ozymandias and the way, as we've just mentioned there, he treated his subjects. It's not even just abusive, it's almost violent and, well, yeah, abusive.
Yeah. What do you take from the heart that fed? I always think that's quite an interesting phrase and could maybe be seen in different ways.
Yeah, it's almost a contradiction within that line, isn't it? Because the
Yeah.
heart that fed could seem to be quite almost kind-hearted.
Whether it's that he needs this ultimate power in order to give back to his people, and is there that sense that despite the fact that he has that ultimate power that he has the ability to abuse, there is still a certain amount of kingship in him, and that he is still working for his kingdom and the citizens of his kingdom, perhaps?
I sometimes think that it makes him seem as though he believes he is right to behave in this way. Yeah. He's still the one who is leading them. He's doing this for his kingdom, but he believes that it is his right as a king to behave like this and to give his subjects a sneer of cold command and to mock them and to treat them in this way.
Yeah.
There's also, I don't know if this is going too far, but almost if he's feeding off the reaction he caused in people, like the fear you mentioned before, Mrs. Edmonds. Like he's feeding off his superiority and the worthlessness of others and the fear he causes.
Yeah, definitely. He definitely seems empowered by that sense of fear that he creates, doesn't he? And that's why I suppose he feels so motivated to hold on to that and create a legacy for the type of power that he's created in life. He's not successful in doing so because of the way that this statue decays over time, but that's what I think what he wants, isn't it?
Yeah. So do you think Shelley is, you mentioned about the statue decaying and ultimately that power being lost, which we will talk about later, but do you think that's what Shelley is trying to show in Ozymandias, that having this kind of form of tyrannical or kind of ultimate power is unsustainable and kind of something that can't possibly last?
Yeah, like it can't be fed forever.
Yeah, and also it's not as valuable as the leader believes it to be. Because I think Ozymandias believes that this power makes him have value and he's left his stamp on the world, but actually we see that it doesn't create a legacy over time in the way that he hopes it will.
Yeah, it's interesting looking, obviously all of our focus when we've been looking at abuse of power in Ozymandias is on that single figure, isn't it? But it's quite different in the way that it's presented in London, the abuse of power, because it's not a singular leader that you're looking at that's abusing the power. It is kind of institutions almost, would you say?
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the key differences is how I think the institutions are quite insular in the way that they are abusing this power. And what I mean by that is it's almost hidden away and it's not as obvious. So for example, when we see runs in blood down palace walls, we presume that the monarchy, so the king or the queen or any of the royal family, are partly to blame for this poverty that's happening in London and the way that people are having to go off and fight and are affected by those things, but that it's not obvious that they're taking responsibility for that. They're hiding behind palace walls and deserve to be blamed for it, but don't I suppose owning up to that in the way that Ozymandias very much wants to be seen. He wants to be known, doesn't he?
I think the imagery there as well of
fighting for king and country becomes an abuse of power, doesn't it? Because the royalty that are safely within the palace walls aren't the ones experiencing bloodshed and suffering.
Yeah, I think the imagery of the runs in blood down palace walls, if you actually kind of think about that as a picture in your head, it's so shocking and stark. And I don't know, I've got quite a visual mind, I suppose, so I always think about that, kind of what that would look like, and it's like something from a horror film, isn't it? It's so stark as an image. It's really critical, I think, from Blake of the institution of monarchy there.
Yeah, the comparisons become really really good between these two poems, don't they? Because like you were saying before, it might be slightly less obvious, this idea of abuse of power by individuals, it being more subtle and more institutionalized. And yet there is that very vivid imagery, almost as if the consequences of the abuse of power are more extreme or more immediately visible in London.
I always think it's quite interesting, and I suppose I'd link the runs in Blood Down Palace Walls to the blackening church, because again we've got this big institution that has a lot of control over people in the same way that the monarchy or royalty does, and then those are kind of contrasted with the chimney sweepers and the soldiers, these kind of individuals, these citizens, and the kind of the power play there is so stark, isn't it? We've got these individuals kind of working compared to these huge groups of people who are controlling, and I think the juxtaposition that's set up there is quite interesting to look at.
Yeah, definitely. And what I think sorry miss.
No, it's okay.
What I always notice here is that with the blackening church, you've got the continuous blackening, as though this situation and the abuse of power that the church has is worsening, and it's going to get to a breaking point, I suppose. We even get this sense that the people might revolt against that. We see the hapless soldier who is completely fed up, and he finds this fact that he's got completely hopeless. So I suppose a little bit reminiscent of the French Revolution that was taking place at this time, we get this sense that there might be people ready to fight against these people with power.
And I suppose in that sense, the blood running down the palace walls might become slightly more ambiguous, in that it's almost a warning of what could happen if the abuse of power continues.
Yeah, definitely. I think we definitely get that double meaning there, don't we?
I was going to say that it's even from the very start of the poem, you get the sense of this control, and it's not yet clear that it's from the institutions we've mentioned yet, but that repetition of chartered just immediately brings to mind this idea that everything is controlled and carefully mapped out, even though it's something as simple and as ordinary as just a street in London and the river, which should flow freely and naturally, but actually it's chartered, it's mapped out and controlled and monitored.
It's interesting, isn't it, then, to look at the word wander at the start, this idea that to wander is to not have a purpose or not to have a path or a map that you're following. It's something free and uncontrolled, and yet even through that wandering that the speaker's doing, it is through these chartered streets. So even if you're attempting to have that freedom, there is still that control that's put on you, and you've not got that same ability to do as you please, I suppose.
So like you mentioned before, that juxtaposition is really important, isn't it, in Blake's poem here?
Yeah, definitely. Should we look at loss of power now then?
Yeah. In orange.
Ready with your nail colour?
I am.
I think you're doing very well writing in this.
It's really hard. It does remind me of being in primary school where you can't quite hold the pen properly, but there we go.
So
can we go back to Ozymandias then first?
Yeah.
So you touched on this before, didn't you? This idea that we do get the evidence of Ozymandias's abuse of power and superiority, but ultimately, I would say the overall message of this poem that Shelley suggests is it could never last. It can never last. Man's power is finite.
Yeah. And what becomes...
We get that straight away, don't we? This imagery of the wreck, the kind of shattered, trunkless image of the statue in the sand is there right from the start. So we actually get that loss of power before we get the abuse and the kind of former power later on.
Definitely. I love the use of juxtaposition in this poem, how we get these hints of what this statue would have looked like at the end of Ozymandias's life and what he hoped it would bring him in terms of a legacy over time, such as this huge statue, and the word colossal making it seem all-powerful. But then those words are juxtaposed with the things that show it's decaying, it's broken, it's not got this power over time, such as wreck and trunkless. I like that wreck, it's capitalised, I suppose, to show that the wreck has become the most important feature of it, rather than it being colossal and more than it being vast. The most noticeable thing is that it's broken.
Yeah, the destruction is the biggest thing.
Yeah, definitely.
I really like the ending of Ozymandias to look at for that loss of power. So of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. And I think ending with the kind of the vast nature, or the vastness of nature, I suppose, is really hammering home what Shelley's trying to communicate, this idea that you can try and have that godlike power, but ultimately the kind of earth and nature and the natural world will be what sustains and lasts after human kind of power has decayed.
I agree. I think it's really important that's the very last line, isn't it? Because it's almost like Ozymandias's legacy has been lost and his power has been lost. At the end of the poem, we are just left with this vast eternal nothingness. To me, that's you were talking about a visual kind of brain before. I get that too, and I just see this endless desert.
Yeah. And he's on his own. The fact that it's lone as well. Ozymandias presumably had people around him when he was alive and when he was in power, and yet now his memory is gone and his power is gone, and he's completely isolated in this desert.
Yeah, and what gave him power was the way that he mistreated people. But now that he is lone only in the form of a statue, and nature becomes more powerful than him, he hasn't got that sense of power anymore.
I've had some students do some really effective analysis of the form of this poem before as well when it comes to power. The fact that we do have this quite epic, dramatic language that we've referred to when we've talked about Ozymandias' abuse of power, and this idea of setting the ruler up to be a godlike king whose legacy will last forever, obviously is proved to be incorrect. And Shelley's chosen to put this in one of the shortest forms of poems there is, a sonnet. It's limited to 14 lines, just like Ozymandias' legacy is limited to his lifetime, really. It ends before he thinks it should.
Yeah, definitely. I think he expects so much from what his power will be after death, but none of that is actually fulfilled, is it?
No.
Should we see how we'd compare that to London then? So whilst the person who lacks power in the poem is Ozymandias, we see a much wider group of people lacking power in London, don't we? We have so many different groups of people, just to demonstrate the damage on London and the people within it.
It isn't a loss of power in London, is it? It is that lack of power. That's the difference. There's people without power in both the poems, but it is that these people have never maybe had power. The kind of everyday people, I suppose.
Yeah.
I'd start with this kind of idea of mind-forged manacles.
I really like this quote.
I think that metaphor is really evocative in that, you know, we've got this idea of being imprisoned, manacles being those kind of chains that would hold people down, and then the idea of them being mind-forged is that they're not physically captured or kind of imprisoned, but it is this kind of imprisonment of the mind. And that industrial imagery coming through again is a very romantic trope, isn't it? That that Blake is kind of blaming this imprisonment on industrialization and the kind of removal of nature from people's lives.
Yeah, I always think that it seems as though it's their class that makes them have these mind-forged manacles, so they feel restricted by the class that they're in. And we know that at this point in time, the vast majority of people would have been lower working class. It was just these very small groups of people who would have had the most money and would have lived a comfortable life, whilst the sense of poverty affected most people. and there doesn't seem to be any way out for them. They've got these manacles that they're restricted by their class, they're restricted by this poverty, and it doesn't seem escapable at all.
Would you link that to the ending, this idea that we get the infant right down, or kind of right up to the marriage hearse? It's kind of the start of life, and then the end, the hearse being the kind of funeral car, the end of life. There's this kind of, within those two lines, that whole timeline or lifeline of a human being, and it's kind of pain and suffering all the way through.
Yeah. Do you find the marriage hearse idea interesting? Because I think that could be seen in different ways, couldn't it? Because I know that the juxtaposition between marriage and here's this idea of the start of marriage being the end at the same time, almost even in happy moments within lifetime.
Do you think it's also connected to the idea that we brought up in the abuse of power section of the fact marriage is obviously associated with at least one of the institutions that Blake has already mentioned in this poem of religion, and therefore perhaps Blake sees it as another form of control and therefore lack of power. Yeah,
definitely. I think the imagery and the kind of, I suppose, sensory imagery of suffering in that second stanza links to that lack of power, doesn't it? The repetition of every cry of every man in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, this kind of constant suffering that's caused by their lack of power.
Yeah, and you really like the use of anaphora here, in every. So when we've got the same opening to several lines, that's called anaphora, and we just get the sense that it's consuming London, isn't it? This sense of fear and poverty and an inability to escape the poverty that they're in as well.
What would you say the difference is then between the loss or lack of power in Ozymandias to how it's presented in London? Do you think it's in the purpose or the focus? As in, do you think Shelley and Blake have got quite similar purposes?
I suppose because of the different perspectives that they're looking at, I'd probably say that it was different. We've already considered what Shelley might be saying about leaders who abuse power and the fact that perhaps human power is finite, I think the idea of Ozymandias expecting his power to continue is very different to the feeling of the people within London and their expectation that their poverty will continue in this sense. It seems as though this idea of expectation seems makes a link between the two poems, but for very different reasons, I suppose. Would you say they're different or similar?
I think that both Shelley in Ozymandias and Blake in London are critical of the same ideas, aren't they? They're critical of people having too much power over other people. They're critical of the kind of the distance between human beings and nature and that kind of aspect, or the greed of human beings trying to overtake nature. But I think you're right in saying that it's the focus, isn't it? While Shelley is focusing on the leader and how destroyed and kind of the loss of power in him, Blake is focusing on the people under the leaders, I suppose. So it's just, I think they've got the same, I think if they were to meet and to chat to each other, they'd probably get on quite well. They've got the same kind of beliefs, haven't they? But they're just focusing on it. They're looking at it from different angles.
Yeah, definitely. Do you think there's anything else that we need to cover before we end?
I don't think so. I think we've got quite a lot there, and obviously anything we've discussed is just our interpretations. When we've been looking at these different quotes, or if there's different parts that you'd focus on, they're probably just as relevant or better than our ideas sometimes. So don't feel like you have to just stick to what we've looked at. please add your own ideas in when you're putting together your planning grid.
Yeah. So if you've not already started doing this, fill in the planning grid that you've been sent, and you might need to re-listen to certain ideas that we've discussed and then come back to the planning grid and do it like that. But hopefully the ideas have been helpful, and speak to you soon.